Hi, everyone, and thank you all for attending, and thanks to my colleagues who are presenting. I actually was operating on the assumption that the speaking order would allow Cynthia Gabriel to first speak on grand corruption, so that I was assuming that she would be referring to many of the specific provisions, as few as there are, of course, so that I thought my topic is a lot more cross-cutting, so so that I would limit myself to making a more general comments on the issue. So as you say, Matthias, the idea of the urgency of doing something against impunity, of actually undertaking effective action against impunity, is, I believe, one of the moving factors behind the states that moved for this session to be held. So on, when we examine the political declaration, we look to see if there's a reflection of that sense of urgency. And unfortunately, spoiler alert, it really is not there. But I think it's important to step back a bit and sort of explain our interest as an organization and the interests of other organizations in similar countries and in regions which are experiencing similar issues. For decades, like all of you, we've been engaged in the work of building and strengthening reforms, passing new laws, creating and strengthening institutions, raising standards of public integrity, and basically trying to deepen democracy and infuse it with greater meaning. We've seen, the amount of work which is being done around transparency. By our colleagues who've been speaking before, and around beneficial ownership and protection of human rights defenders, etc., etc. But clearly these efforts haven't been crowned with success. The last CPI, I quote the CPI with, well, I think on this level I can quote it, that it's noted that most countries have made little to no progress in tackling corruption in nearly a decade. And most of the countries have scored less than half of the sort of 100-point mark in terms of addressing corruption. And even some of the countries of the world which have prided themselves on being advanced democracies have suffered humiliating setbacks in the last period. So we've seen the forward march of authoritarianism and of impunity. And many of the reforms which we've talked about here today are based, I think, on ideas about the relationship between principal and agent. The idea that if the principal, who is the citizen, presumably the citizen or the populace, knows what their agent, the government, is doing, that they'll be better able to control what that agent is doing. Now that assumes that the principal knows that they're a principal, has the levels of action against the agent, and that the agent cares. I think if you look at the nature of impunity, you'll see that the agent often is more powerful than the principal, and really thumbs their nose at the principle, which is why I think transparency reforms are a necessary precondition. Nobody is saying that any of these reforms which we've been working on are unnecessary. They're merely insufficient in terms of getting real traction against corruption. We know that the impunity means the loss of vast amounts of resources. That has been covered adequately in probably the declaration itself and elsewhere. It means the loss of resources which could have been devoted to health, education, security, etc. And the most dangerous thing about impunity is it implants corruption in the DNA of how states operate, and therefore reproduces itself, and is remarkably resilient in surviving all sorts of anti-corruption campaigns, all sorts of reform measures, and going through the motions of reform while producing precious little in terms of real impact on corruption. In situations of deeply embedded corruptions, terms such as state capture are increasingly in use to describe a situation where an elite subverts or repurposes public institutions and processes to serve private interess by fashioning law and policy into means of extracting public resources, even as it continues to bear many of the features of a conventional state, you know, regular elections, parliaments which meet and deliberate, etc., etc. But for capture to succeed, it must do many of the things which mean that it undermines doing what the political declaration here, even as lukewarm as it might be considered, many of the things which it sets out to do are undermined by impunity. For capture to succeed, it must eviscerate oversight institutions, leaves them standing, but hollows out their capacity to meaningfully act. Here we're looking at auditor generals, parliamentary committees, etc. It must weaken law enforcement and rule of law institutions, the police, prosecutorial agencies, judiciary, hollow out their independence. Or if they are used, direct them against, weaponize them and direct them against political opponents using anti-corruption campaigns as a political tool. And it must block channels of political change and accountability, for example, through periodic elections. So people line up for hours, cast their vote, and it means nothing. Increasingly, electoral management bodies are compromised, or violence is used to intimidate opponents. And the space for countervailing institutions must be shrunk until they pose no threat to capture. And these are systems which select for corruption. They select for the corrupt, and those with integrity quickly get weeded out. They get hounded. They get tossed out of the system. So even though we had this recognition of the urgency for dealing with impunity, it's difficult to see how this vision has informed the political declaration that has emerged and what remained of the original idea. There's hardly an explicit mention of impunity and no specific commitment on grand corruption. Impunity is the elephant in the room. It's central to the reasons for the lack of significant progress against corruption, but well nigh unnamed. And if you don't name it, then you're not going to be able to address it. And you're not going to develop the mechanism, have these debates and the discussions to actually counter it. So with 9 years left to the 2030 SDG deadline, we would have expected more trenchant, specific, and unequivocal commitments. No doubt the document contains relevant commitments, but they fall short of the necessary boldness and vision. And this is not for lack of examples within the knowledge of member states which could have inspired them. We have expert groups meeting which have been held in Lima and in Oslo, which have come out with recommendations on impunity. And you can, those of you who aren't familiar with it will find that on the UNODC website, recommendations which would seem worthy of attention and worthy of serious consideration. The FACTI panel recommendations have been mentioned, and they're concise and concrete, and they would seem to deserve much more than the lukewarm response they've gotten from the political declaration that we've seen, which basically just notes the recommendations of the FACTI panel, including on tax justice, which is increasingly of relevance to citizens who are taxed without getting services, or indeed taxed without anything which could be described as meaningful representation, given the situation of capture I described above. So I won't go into detail on it, but I think that many of the ideas which have been mooted in the Oslo statement on corruption involving vast quantities of assets, including measures which would seem quite simple to adopt, quite not necessarily controversial, such as the setting up a special rapporteur on anti-corruption and international special rapporteurs, such as there are for other areas. The development of a protocol perhaps would mean more development of a protocol to UNCAC on corruption involving vast quantities of assets. But looking at innovative and inclusive solutions to address cross-border corruption at the international level, even if I can understand the wariness around proposals such as an international anti-corruption court, there's a lot to be learned from the experiences of combating impunity for crimes against humanity, including complex issues around state cooperation, immunity of high-level officials, equality before the law, victim reparations, etc. So I think these are worthy of debate and discussion, and surely, they've been proposed, therefore, there should be a readiness to look at some of these issues. The international commissions against, economic crimes, etc., when conditions are ripe, also other issues. I should add, I will close by adding just a bit of concern on what I see as significant omissions. Even while the political declaration mentions the readiness to use technology to counter corruption, there's no mention of the urgency of addressing the use of technology for nefarious ends, including, shrinking civic space, cybercrime, the use of cryptocurrencies in organized crime, etc. So, and also the issue of hidden debt, which is becoming increasingly critical. Populations are being constrained to pay for debts which they were not consulted when they were being acquired, and which disappear with no impact on the population. And I think there's various countries where this has become a big issue. So I'll close by just expressing that some of us have tried to be constructive and sort of note the progress that has been made, but given the multifaceted nature of the crises which we're facing, this really is not indicative of the level of commitment which we would need to even make any dent on the problems we face within the next 9 years. And definitely given the fact that we've lost time due to COVID, there's, we could have done much better than this. Thank you very much.